The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises, a golden age remembered. There was once a time, often romanticized in mid 20th century America, when a single income could comfortably support an entire family. The husband worked, the wife managed the household, and children grew up without the stress of financial instability. Life seemed simple, predictable, and sustainable. However, the economic boom of the post World War II era did not last forever. By the 1970s, the cost of living began to climb at an unprecedented pace. Economic pressures forced many families to reconsider traditional roles, with women entering the workforce in increasing numbers to help make ends meet. This societal shift, while empowering for women in terms of independence and financial contribution, was a necessity rather than a luxury for most families. Fast forward to the 1990s, and even with dual incomes, families found it increasingly difficult to sustain their lifestyles. Wages stagnated while the costs of housing, healthcare, and education surged, eroding the middle class dream. Savings, once a cornerstone of financial security, became a rare luxury. By the 2000s, with both partners working full time and savings depleted, families turned to borrowing. Credit cards, mortgages, and personal loans became lifelines, but they also tethered families to mounting debt. For many, the pursuit of financial stability transformed into a desperate struggle to stay afloat. Living beyond one's means became the norm, driven not by extravagance, but by the relentless rise in living costs and the illusion of keeping up with societal expectations. This transformation in household economics laid the groundwork for a system increasingly reliant on debt and unsustainable growth, pushing families and entire economies to the brink of collapse. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The origins of the modern financial system. The foundations of the modern global financial system were laid at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, held in the midst of World War II. Delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in New Hampshire to design a framework that would ensure economic stability and prevent the competitive devaluations and trade barriers that had exacerbated the Great Depression. At its core, the Bretton Woods Agreement sought to create a stable, predictable system of international trade and finance, with the US dollar at its center. Under this system, the US dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This gold-backed dollar gave nations confidence in the value of their reserves, providing a sense of security in international transactions. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank were also established during this conference to promote global economic growth, provide financial assistance, and facilitate the rebuilding of war-torn economies. Initially, the Bretton Woods system succeeded in its mission. Post-war economies flourished, global trade expanded, and the U.S. emerged as the dominant economic power. The dollar became the world's primary reserve currency, symbolizing stability and trust. However, as the global economy grew, so did the cracks in this seemingly stable system. By the 1960s, the United States found itself under mounting pressure to maintain the gold standard. Persistent trade deficits, rising government spending, driven by programs like the Great Society and the Vietnam War, and the demand for dollars from international markets began to strain the system. The U.S. was effectively printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. This inherent imbalance sowed the seeds of future instability. While the Bretton Woods Agreement aimed to create a foundation of economic stability, its reliance on the U.S. dollar as the world's anchor currency introduced vulnerabilities that would later lead to its collapse. The legacy of Bretton Woods is twofold. It brought unparalleled growth and prosperity in the early decades, but also laid the groundwork for the transition to a fiat currency system. This shift, while providing governments with greater flexibility, introduced a new era of financial volatility and uncertainty. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The Nixon Shock and the birth of fiat currency. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that would fundamentally alter the global financial landscape. He unilaterally ended the convertibility of the US dollar into gold. This historic move, now known as the Nixon Shock, marked the official abandonment of the Bretton Woods system and ushered in the era of fiat currency. For the first time, the US dollar, and subsequently, most currencies worldwide would no longer be backed by a tangible asset like gold, but instead derive its value solely from trust in the issuing government. This decision was not made in a vacuum. Throughout the 1960s, the United States faced growing economic pressures. Trade deficits, rising inflation, and the financial burden of the Vietnam War created a situation where the U.S. was printing far more dollars than it could cover with its gold reserves. As confidence in the dollar's stability waned, foreign governments began demanding the conversion of their dollar holdings into gold, placing unsustainable pressure on U.S. gold reserves. Nixon's announcement was a temporary measure to stabilize the economy and combat inflation. However, it became a permanent shift, leading to the end of the gold standard, not only in the U.S., but globally. Without the constraint of gold backing, central banks gained the flexibility to print money as needed, giving governments the ability to respond more dynamically to economic crises. This newfound flexibility came with significant consequences. The transition to fiat currency fundamentally changed the nature of money. No longer tied to a physical commodity, the value of money became entirely dependent on public confidence in the government and central banks. While this system allowed for economic expansion and the ability to fund large-scale projects, it also opened the door to inflation, currency manipulation, and financial speculation. For everyday citizens, the shift to fiat currency meant their money was no longer intrinsically valuable. It was valuable because the government said it was. This intangible foundation created an economic system that could grow exponentially, but also one that became increasingly fragile. The Nixon Shock set the stage for the modern financial world, one dominated by debt, monetary policy, and cycles of boom and bust, driven by trust in institutions that are, themselves, not immune to failure. The abandonment of the gold standard was a turning point that provided short-term relief but introduced long-term uncertainty. It reshaped the global economy into one where money could be created out of thin air, a power that governments and central banks wield to this day, often with consequences that ripple through every aspect of modern life. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises, the Ponzi scheme of the global economy. The transition to fiat currency after the Nixon shock not only reshaped the global financial system, but also introduced a troubling characteristic. The economy began to resemble a massive Ponzi scheme. Unlike the gold standard, where the value of currency was tied to a finite physical asset, the new monetary system allowed money to be created from debt. This reliance on perpetual borrowing to sustain economic growth became both a feature and a flaw of the modern global economy. At its core, a Ponzi scheme relies on continuous inflows of new money to pay returns to earlier participants. Similarly, the global economy became dependent on the constant expansion of credit and debt to fuel growth. Governments borrowed to finance public spending, corporations borrowed to expand operations, and consumers borrowed to maintain their standard of living. However, this system operated on a dangerous assumption that growth would continue indefinitely to service the ever-increasing levels of debt. The proliferation of debt led to the illusion of prosperity. Asset values, such as real estate, stocks, and bonds, skyrocketed, creating paper wealth for investors and homeowners. However, this wealth was largely inflated, supported by cheap credit and speculative markets, rather than real economic productivity. At the same time, the purchasing power of money declined as inflation eroded wages and savings. People appeared richer on paper, but felt poorer in real life, as their money bought less and less over time. Central banks played a pivotal role in maintaining this fragile system. By lowering interest rates and engaging in quantitative easing, they made borrowing easier and more attractive. While these policies temporarily stimulated growth, they also encouraged unsustainable levels of debt. Governments, businesses, and individuals became addicted to cheap money, building an economic house of cards that could collapse at any moment. The consequences of this Ponzi-like structure were profound. Wealth inequality widened as those who owned assets benefited from rising prices, while those who relied on wages struggled to keep up with inflation. Financial markets became increasingly detached from the real economy, driven by speculation rather than fundamental value. Meanwhile, the system's reliance on debt created a ticking time bomb. Any significant disruption, Be it a financial crisis, geopolitical instability, or a global pandemic, could trigger a cascade of defaults and economic collapse. The Ponzi scheme analogy is more than just a metaphor. It highlights the systemic risks inherent in a debt-driven economy. As debt levels continue to rise globally, the question remains, how long can the system sustain itself before it reaches a breaking point? Without meaningful reforms, the global economy risks falling into the same trap as a classic Ponzi scheme, an inevitable crash when new money can no longer keep up with the obligations of the past. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. Government bonds as IOUs, commitment or deception? At the heart of modern government financing lies the concept of bonds, effectively IOUs, issued to raise funds for public projects, social programs, and increasingly to cover budget deficits. In theory, government bonds represent a promise to repay borrowed money with interest, providing investors with a relatively safe place to park their capital. However, beneath this facade of security lies a deeper truth. Government bonds often serve as instruments of deferred responsibility, shifting today's financial burdens onto future generations. When a government issues bonds, it is essentially borrowing money from investors with the pledge to repay it at a later date. This borrowed capital is used to fund everything from infrastructure development to defense spending. While these projects can contribute to long-term economic growth, the reality is that much of the borrowing today is not for investment, but to plug deficits in bloated budgets. Governments routinely spend more than they collect in taxes, relying on bonds to cover the shortfall. This reliance on bonds creates a dangerous cycle. As governments accumulate more debt, they must issue even more bonds to refinance existing obligations and pay interest on earlier borrowings. Over time, the total debt grows exponentially, leading to mounting pressure on public finances. While bondholders, often institutional investors like banks, pension funds, and foreign governments, are willing to lend to creditworthy nations, their patience is not infinite. A loss of confidence in a government's ability to repay its debt can trigger a financial crisis, as seen in countries like Greece during the Eurozone debt crisis. For future generations, the consequences are significant. The debt issued today must eventually be repaid, either through higher taxes, reduced public services, or additional borrowing. This intergenerational transfer of debt places an enormous burden on young and unborn citizens who must bear the costs of their predecessors' fiscal irresponsibility. In essence, bonds allow governments to spend money they don't have while leaving the bill for someone else to pay. Moreover, the perception of bonds as safe investments can be misleading. In many cases, their value is eroded by inflation, meaning that the purchasing power of the money repaid is significantly lower than the amount initially borrowed. Investors accept this trade-off because bonds provide a predictable return, but the hidden cost of inflation makes bonds less stable than they appear. The bond market, often seen as a cornerstone of financial stability, is thus a double-edged sword. While it enables governments to finance critical initiatives, it also perpetuates a system of deferred accountability. The question remains, are bonds truly a tool for growth and stability, or are they simply a sophisticated mechanism for kicking the can down the road? As global debt levels reach unprecedented heights, the answer to this question becomes more urgent with each passing day. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. Inflation and the erosion of purchasing power. Inflation is often referred to as a silent thief, steadily eroding the purchasing power of money over time. While some level of inflation is a natural part of a growing economy, excessive or poorly managed inflation can have devastating effects on individuals, families, and entire societies. For decades, the middle class, once the backbone of economic stability, has borne the brunt of inflation's insidious impact. The fundamental issue lies in the disparity between wages and the rising cost of goods and services. Over the years, wage growth has lagged significantly behind inflation. While nominal incomes may appear to increase, their real value, adjusted for inflation, often stagnates or declines. This means that for many workers, even as they earn more on paper, their money buys less than it did in previous decades. Essentials like housing, healthcare, education, and food have seen particularly steep price increases, placing immense pressure on middle-class families. For example, consider the housing market. In many parts of the world, home prices have skyrocketed, far outpacing wage growth. This has made homeownership a traditional marker of financial stability, an unattainable dream for many young families. Similarly, the cost of higher education has ballooned, leaving graduates burdened with crippling student loan debt that further diminishes their ability to build wealth or save for the future. Inflation also exacerbates income inequality. Those who own assets such as real estate, stocks, or commodities often benefit from inflation as the value of their holdings increases. In contrast, those who rely solely on wages find themselves falling further behind. This dynamic widens the gap between the wealthy and the rest of the population, eroding social cohesion and creating a sense of economic insecurity. Furthermore, inflation erodes the value of savings. For individuals who have diligently set aside money for retirement or emergencies, the steady loss of purchasing power can be devastating. A dollar saved today is worth significantly less tomorrow, particularly in high inflation environments. This discourages saving and encourages spending or risky investments, further destabilizing personal finances and the broader economy. Central banks often attempt to control inflation through monetary policy, such as raising interest rates to reduce spending. However, these measures are not without consequences. Higher interest rates can stifle economic growth, increase unemployment, and make borrowing more expensive, creating a precarious balancing act for policymakers. For the middle class, the combination of stagnant wages, rising costs, and the erosion of savings has led to a feeling of being perpetually squeezed. Many families live paycheck to paycheck, with little or no financial cushion to absorb unexpected expenses or economic shocks. This vulnerability leaves them exposed to further hardship during periods of economic downturn or crisis. In the long run, unchecked inflation undermines trust in the economy and the currency itself. If people lose faith in their money's ability to hold value, it can lead to behaviors like hoarding goods or converting cash into hard assets, further destabilizing the system. Addressing inflation and its impact on purchasing power requires not only careful monetary policy, but also structural reforms that ensure equitable wage growth and affordable access to essential services. Without these changes, the middle class will continue to bear the weight of inflation, with potentially dire consequences for economic and social stability. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. Occupy Wall Street. A wave of public outrage. The 2008 global financial crisis was a watershed moment in modern economic history, laying bare the stark inequalities and systemic failures of the global financial system. Millions of people lost their homes, jobs, and savings as the housing market collapsed and banks teetered on the brink of insolvency. Yet, while ordinary citizens bore the brunt of the crisis, many of the financial institutions that caused the collapse were deemed too big to fail and were bailed out with taxpayer money. This glaring disparity in accountability and power sparked widespread outrage and gave birth to one of the most iconic social movements of the 21st century, Occupy Wall Street. Launched in September 2011, Occupy Wall Street began as a modest protest in Zuccotti Park in New York City. However, it quickly gained traction, resonating with millions of people across the United States and around the world. The movement's rallying cry, "We are the 99%, highlighted the deep divide between the wealthiest 1% of society, those who controlled a disproportionate share of wealth and power, and the remaining 99% who faced growing economic insecurity. Occupy Wall Street was not merely a protest against income inequality. It was a broader critique of systemic issues within capitalism. Protesters condemned corporate greed, the outsized influence of money in politics, and the lack of accountability for financial institutions that had gambled recklessly with the global economy. The movement also shed light on issues such as student loan debt, stagnant wages, rising healthcare costs, and the erosion of workers' rights. What set Occupy Wall Street apart from previous movements was its decentralized structure and use of social media to mobilize and spread its message. There were no formal leaders, and decisions were made collectively through general assemblies. While this approach empowered grassroots participation, it also made it difficult for the movement to articulate a cohesive set of demands or negotiate with policymakers. Despite its challenges, Occupy Wall Street had a lasting impact on public discourse. It brought terms like the 1 cent and economic inequality into mainstream conversation and inspired similar movements worldwide, from Spain's Indignados to the anti-austerity protests in Greece. It also put pressure on governments and financial institutions to address some of the underlying causes of the crisis, though many argue that meaningful reform has been limited. Critics of Occupy Wall Street often dismissed it as disorganized or lacking a clear agenda. However, the movement's significance lies not in specific policy achievements, but in its ability to channel widespread frustration and expose systemic flaws. It served as a wake-up call, reminding the world that unchecked inequality and corporate power pose serious threats to democracy and social cohesion. In the years since the protests, many of the issues raised by Occupy Wall Street have only intensified. Wealth inequality has continued to grow, and the financial sector remains largely unaccountable. Yet the movement's legacy endures in the form of heightened awareness and ongoing activism. Occupy Wall Street was more than a moment of public outrage. It was a powerful symbol of the need for systemic change in an increasingly unequal world. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The Great Recession and Lessons Unlearned. The Great Recession of 2008 to 2009 was a seismic event that exposed deep flaws in the global financial system. Triggered by the collapse of the U.S. housing market and the subsequent unraveling of complex financial instruments tied to subprime mortgages, the crisis rippled across the globe, plunging economies into recession, devastating millions of lives, and eroding public trust in financial institutions. It was, by all measures, a historic opportunity to address systemic weaknesses and implement meaningful reforms. Yet, instead of tackling the root causes of the collapse, central banks and governments largely opted for short-term fixes that merely kicked the can down the road. The financial system's fragility was laid bare during the crisis. Banks that had grown too big to fail engaged in reckless lending and speculative activities, driven by the pursuit of short-term profits. Risky mortgage-backed securities and derivatives, poorly understood even by those who traded them, became the financial equivalent of ticking time bombs. When these instruments began to implode, the interconnected nature of global finance ensured that the fallout would be both widespread and catastrophic. In response, led by the U.S. Federal Reserve, turned to aggressive monetary policies to stabilize the economy. Interest rates were slashed to near zero, and unprecedented levels of quantitative easing, QE, flooded financial markets with liquidity. Trillions of dollars were injected into the banking system to prevent its collapse, and massive bailout packages were extended to financial institutions and corporations deemed essential to the economy. While these measures succeeded in averting a total financial meltdown, they came at a significant cost. The decision to bail out banks and large corporations, many of which were directly responsible for the crisis, left a bitter taste for the general public. Ordinary citizens who lost jobs, homes, and savings were forced to bear the brunt of austerity measures and stagnant wage growth, while those at the top of the financial pyramid largely escaped accountability. Moreover, the reliance on money printing and low interest rates created new vulnerabilities. The surge of cheap money inflated asset bubbles in housing, stock markets, and other sectors, setting the stage for future crises. Instead of addressing structural issues, such as the lack of effective regulation, the dangers of speculative finance, and the concentration of economic power, policymakers doubled down on the very strategies that had enabled the crisis in the first place. One of the most glaring failures was the lack of meaningful reform in the banking sector. Although legislation like the Dodd-Frank Act was introduced in the U.S. to increase oversight and reduce systemic risks, its implementation was watered down by lobbying from powerful financial institutions. Many of the same practices that fueled the Great Recession, such as excessive risk-taking, speculative trading, and insufficient capital reserves, persist to this day. The Great Recession should have been a turning point, a moment to rethink the fundamental principles of the financial system and prioritize stability, fairness, and accountability. Instead, it became a missed opportunity. The lessons of 2008 remain largely unlearned, and the global economy remains on precarious footing. For many, the crisis was not just an economic failure, but a moral one. It highlighted the disparity between those who wield power in the financial system and those who suffer its consequences. While the system was patched up, the underlying weaknesses remain, leaving the world vulnerable to future shocks. As the cycle of boom and bust continues, the question remains, how many more crises will it take before meaningful change is achieved? The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises, money printing and bailout policies, a temporary lifeline with long-term consequences. The global financial system's response to economic crises has often relied on two controversial tools: aggressive money printing and massive bailout packages. While these measures can stabilize economies in the short term, they come with significant long-term repercussions that jeopardize the sustainability of financial systems and economies worldwide. When the Great Recession struck in 2008, central banks and governments turned to money printing, more formally known as quantitative easing, QE, as a means to inject liquidity into the financial system. The idea was to make borrowing cheaper, encourage spending and investment, and prevent the collapse of credit markets. Trillions of dollars were created out of thin air and funneled into the banking system, driving down interest rates and making capital more accessible. Simultaneously, governments around the world rolled out massive bailout packages to rescue financial institutions, corporations, and in some cases, entire industries. Banks deemed too big to fail received unprecedented levels of support, often without significant accountability or reform. While these measures averted a complete economic meltdown, they also set a dangerous precedent, signaling to large institutions that they could take excessive risks with the expectation of government intervention if things went awry. In the short term, these policies appeared to work. Stock markets rebounded, financial institutions stabilized, and economies slowly recovered from the brink of collapse. However, the longer-term consequences of money printing and bailouts have been far more problematic. One of the most significant effects has been the explosion of public debt. Governments financed bailouts and stimulus measures by borrowing heavily, pushing debt levels to unprecedented heights. For example, U.S. national debt more than doubled in the decade following the 2008 crisis, creating a fiscal overhang that constrains future policy options. Servicing this debt requires substantial government revenues, often leading to cuts in public services or increases in taxes, further burdening ordinary citizens. Another major consequence has been the creation of massive asset bubbles. The flood of cheap money from central banks inflated the value of stocks, real estate, and other assets to levels far beyond their intrinsic worth. While this enriched investors and asset holders, it also widened the gap between the wealthy and everyone else. For many, the dream of homeownership or building a retirement fund became increasingly out of reach as asset prices soared, fueled by speculative behavior and easy credit. Moreover, money printing and bailouts have distorted market dynamics. By propping up failing institutions and keeping interest rates artificially low, policymakers have undermined the principles of free market capitalism. Inefficient businesses that would have otherwise failed were kept afloat, creating a phenomenon known as zombie companies, firms that survive only because of low borrowing costs. This misallocation of resources stifles innovation and productivity, slowing long-term economic growth. The policies also carry the hidden danger of inflation. While inflation remained relatively low in the years immediately following the Great Recession, the unprecedented scale of money printing in response to the COVID-19 pandemic reignited fears of runaway inflation. As more money chases the same amount of goods and services, prices inevitably rise, eroding the purchasing power of consumers and destabilizing economies. In the end, money printing and bailouts are like applying a bandage to a deep wound. They may stop the bleeding temporarily, but do little to address the underlying problem. These policies have created a fragile system that is increasingly reliant on debt, speculative growth, and government intervention. As the world faces new challenges, from geopolitical tensions to climate change, the limits of these strategies are becoming increasingly apparent. The question remains, how long can this cycle of money printing and bailouts continue before the system breaks under its own weight? Without structural reforms and a reevaluation of economic priorities, the next crisis may prove even more devastating than the last. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The call to return to the gold standard. In recent years, as economic instability and financial crises have become more frequent, a growing number of economists and financial analysts have advocated for a return to the gold standard. They argue that tying currency to gold, a tangible and finite resource, would restore discipline to monetary policy, curb inflation, and prevent the excessive money printing that has characterized the fiat currency era. However, this proposal is met with significant resistance from major nations and central banks that have grown accustomed to the flexibility of fiat currency systems. The gold standard, which existed in various forms before its abandonment in the mid-20th century, required governments to back their currencies with a fixed amount of gold. This system provided stability and predictability, as the money supply was directly tied to the availability of gold reserves. Advocates of a return to the gold standard argue that it would eliminate the ability of governments and central banks to manipulate currencies for short-term political or economic gains, thereby fostering long-term economic stability. Proponents also highlight how the gold standard could address the growing problem of public and private debt. Under the current fiat system, governments and individuals can borrow excessively, relying on central banks to keep interest rates low and print more money to support spending. A gold-backed currency, however, would impose strict limits on the amount of money that could be created, forcing fiscal responsibility and discouraging reckless borrowing. Despite these potential benefits, the idea of returning to the gold standard faces significant challenges. For one, major economies like the United States, China, and the European Union are heavily invested in the fiat currency system. Fiat currencies allow governments to respond flexibly to economic crises by adjusting money supply and implementing monetary policies tailored to specific situations. A gold standard, by contrast, would constrain their ability to do so, potentially exacerbating economic downturns. Additionally, transitioning back to the gold standard would require nations to amass vast amounts of gold to back their currencies. This would create significant imbalances, as countries with limited gold reserves would struggle to participate in the system. It could also lead to intense competition for gold, driving up its price and destabilizing markets in the short term. Critics also argue that the gold standard is not immune to economic volatility. Historical evidence shows that the gold standard itself contributed to severe economic disruptions, such as deflationary spirals and prolonged recessions, as countries struggled to maintain fixed exchange rates. The Great Depression of the 1930s, for instance, was exacerbated by the rigidities of the gold standard, which limited governments' ability to stimulate their economies through monetary policy. Finally, there is the issue of practicality in a modern, interconnected global economy. Today's financial systems are vastly more complex than those of the gold standard era, involving trillions of dollars in daily transactions across digital platforms. Pegging currencies to gold would require a complete overhaul of financial infrastructure, an endeavor that is not only costly, but also fraught with logistical challenges. While the gold standard offers the allure of stability and fiscal discipline, its limitations make it an unlikely solution in a world that prioritizes economic flexibility and growth. The debate over its merits reflects broader concerns about the sustainability of the current financial system, but a return to the gold standard remains more of an intellectual exercise than a realistic policy option. As calls for reform continue, it is clear that the global economy needs a new approach, one that balances the discipline of the past with the adaptability of the present. Whether this involves a hybrid system, a rethinking of monetary policy, or entirely new mechanisms, the lessons of the gold standard will undoubtedly shape the future of finance. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The price of gold and manipulation schemes. Gold has long been regarded as the ultimate barometer of economic health and stability. As a finite, tangible asset, it has historically been seen as a safe haven during times of financial uncertainty, offering a reliable store of value when fiat currencies falter. However, the price of gold, despite its fundamental importance, has often been subject to manipulation by powerful financial institutions, undermining its role as a true measure of economic conditions and a dependable hedge against market volatility. The manipulation of gold prices typically occurs through the use of paper gold markets, where financial institutions trade gold derivatives such as futures and options. These instruments allow traders to speculate on the price of gold without physically owning the metal. While derivatives serve a legitimate purpose in hedging risks and providing liquidity, they also create opportunities for large players to exert outsized influence on market prices. By flooding the market with contracts or engaging in coordinated selling, these entities can artificially depress or inflate gold prices, creating distortions that do not reflect the metal's true supply and demand dynamics. One of the most well-known cases of alleged gold price manipulation involves bullion banks, large financial institutions that play a central role in the gold market. These banks are accused of shorting gold, selling large quantities of gold futures contracts without owning the underlying metal, in order to drive prices downward. This strategy not only benefits the bank's proprietary trading positions, but also protects their other financial interests, as a rising gold price is often seen as a warning signal of economic instability that could hurt broader markets. The impact of this manipulation extends far beyond traders and investors. For nations that rely on gold reserves to back their currencies or stabilize their economies, artificially low gold prices can erode the value of these reserves. Developing countries, in particular, often depend on gold exports as a critical source of revenue. When gold prices are manipulated downward, these nations suffer economically, exacerbating global inequality. Moreover, gold price manipulation undermines public trust in financial markets. For individuals who turn to gold as a safe store of value, particularly during times of crisis, manipulated prices can lead to significant losses or missed opportunities. This is especially harmful for small investors who lack the resources or insider knowledge to navigate complex market dynamics effectively. Despite numerous allegations and investigations, holding perpetrators accountable for gold price manipulation has proven challenging. Regulatory bodies often face significant hurdles in proving intent or identifying concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The highly opaque nature of gold trading, combined with the immense financial resources of large institutions, makes it difficult to enforce meaningful oversight. The manipulation of gold prices also has broader implications for the global economy. Gold is often viewed as a hedge against inflation and currency devaluation. When its price is artificially suppressed, it sends misleading signals to markets, policymakers, and the public about the true state of economic stability. This distortion can delay necessary reforms or create a false sense of security, leaving economies vulnerable to sudden shocks. To restore gold's role as a reliable store of value and an accurate economic indicator, greater transparency and accountability are needed in the gold market. Enhanced oversight of derivative trading, stricter regulations on market manipulation, and stronger enforcement mechanisms could help mitigate the influence of large financial institutions. Additionally, encouraging the physical ownership of gold, rather than relying on paper contracts, could reduce the leverage that enables manipulation. Ultimately, the manipulation of gold prices highlights a broader challenge within the global financial system: the concentration of power in the hands of a few institutions that prioritize profit over fairness and stability. Addressing this issue is not just about safeguarding gold's reputation. It is about ensuring a more equitable and transparent financial system for all. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. Bullion banks and fraudulent accounting. Bullion banks, institutions that trade and store precious metals like gold, play a critical role in the global financial system. These banks facilitate gold transactions, lend gold to other entities, and provide storage services for both private and institutional investors. However, beneath the surface of these operations lies a troubling reality. Many bullion banks engage in questionable accounting practices that conceal discrepancies in their gold holdings, eroding investor confidence and undermining the integrity of the gold market. One of the most common issues involves the practice of fractional reserve gold banking. Similar to how traditional banks operate with fractional reserves of cash, bullion banks often hold only a fraction of the gold they owe to clients. For example, if a bank has issued gold certificates or contracts for 100 metric tons of gold, it may only physically hold a fraction of that amount in its vaults. The rest of the obligations are covered by paper gold contracts or promises to deliver gold in the future. While this practice allows banks to profit from lending and trading, it introduces significant risks, particularly during times of market stress or increased demand for physical gold. These risks are exacerbated by fraudulent accounting practices. Some bullion banks have been accused of overstating their gold reserves or using complex financial instruments to obscure the true state of their holdings. For instance, a bank might record leased gold, gold it has lent out to another entity, as part of its reserves, even though the gold is no longer physically in its possession. This creates a misleading impression of financial stability and amplifies the potential for a liquidity crisis if multiple clients demand the delivery of physical gold simultaneously. The lack of transparency in gold accounting further complicates the issue. Unlike other financial assets, gold transactions are often conducted in opaque over-the-counter markets, where detailed reporting is not required. This makes it difficult for regulators, investors, and even governments to assess the true state of bullion banks' operations. The opacity creates an environment ripe for manipulation and abuse, as banks can operate with little fear of scrutiny or accountability. The consequences of these practices are far-reaching. For investors, the realization that their gold holdings may be largely paper rather than physical can lead to panic and a rush to withdraw funds or demand delivery. This, in turn, can trigger a cascading liquidity crisis as banks struggle to meet their obligations. Such scenarios not only harm individual investors, but also destabilize the broader gold market, which serves as a cornerstone of financial stability for many economies. For governments and central banks, fraudulent accounting by bullion banks poses a direct threat to national reserves. Many countries rely on bullion banks to store or manage their gold reserves, which are used to back currencies or stabilize economies. If these reserves are misrepresented or mismanaged, it could undermine the credibility of entire monetary systems and create ripple effects across global markets. Addressing these issues requires a multi-pronged approach. First, regulators must implement stricter oversight of bullion banks, requiring detailed and transparent reporting of gold holdings and transactions. This includes clear distinctions between physical and paper gold assets, as well as independent audits to verify reserves. Second, investors should be encouraged to demand greater accountability from banks, including the option to take physical delivery of their gold. Finally, international cooperation is needed to standardize gold market regulations and close loopholes that allow for fraudulent practices. Ultimately, the integrity of the gold market depends on trust. Trust that gold holdings are accurately reported, safely stored, and readily available when needed. Without significant reforms, the continued use of fraudulent accounting practices by bullion banks risks undermining this trust, with potentially catastrophic consequences for both investors and the global financial system. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. The aftermath of the pandemic, uncontrolled debt expansion. The COVID-19 pandemic was not just a health crisis, it was a financial earthquake that shook the global economy to its core. Governments and central banks worldwide responded with unprecedented levels of fiscal and monetary intervention to cushion the economic fallout. While these measures were necessary to prevent immediate collapse, the sheer scale of debt expansion during this period has left many experts deeply concerned about the long-term stability of the global financial system. As businesses shuttered, supply chains were disrupted, and unemployment soared, governments were forced to inject massive amounts of capital into their economies. Trillions of dollars were spent on stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, healthcare support, and business bailouts. Central banks complemented these efforts with aggressive monetary policies, slashing interest rates to near zero and engaging in large-scale quantitative easing. The result was a dramatic increase in both public and private debt, pushing global debt levels to record highs. In 2020 alone, global debt surged to over $300 trillion, equivalent to more than 350% of the world's GDP. Developed nations, with their access to capital markets, led this borrowing spree. The United States, for instance, saw its national debt skyrocket to over $30 trillion, fueled by massive spending on pandemic relief programs. Emerging economies also took on significant to cope with the crisis, often at the cost of future fiscal stability. While these actions provided short-term relief, they have created long-term vulnerabilities. The most pressing concern is the sustainability of this debt. Governments that borrowed heavily during the pandemic now face the challenge of repaying or refinancing their obligations in an environment of rising interest rates and slowing economic growth. For many nations, particularly those in the developing world, this could lead to debt crises, defaults, or the need for painful austerity measures that further strain their economies. The private sector is similarly burdened. Businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, took on significant debt to survive the pandemic. As these loans come due, many may struggle to meet their obligations, leading to a wave of bankruptcies and job losses. Meanwhile, households that relied on credit to weather the crisis now face mounting financial pressures as inflation erodes their purchasing power and interest rates climb. Perhaps the most troubling consequence of the pandemic-era debt expansion is the distortion it has created in financial markets. The flood of cheap money has inflated asset prices to unsustainable levels, creating bubbles in sectors like housing, equities, and cryptocurrencies. While these bubbles have enriched a small segment of the population, they have also widened the gap between the wealthy and the economically vulnerable, exacerbating inequality and social unrest. The risk of a systemic financial collapse looms large. With debt levels so high, even a minor economic shock, such as geopolitical tensions, a sudden tightening of monetary policy, or another global crisis, could trigger a domino effect of defaults and market crashes. Central banks and governments, having already deployed much of their monetary and fiscal arsenal during the pandemic, may find themselves with limited tools to respond. Addressing these challenges will require bold and coordinated action. Policymakers must find ways to reduce debt burdens without stifling growth, such as through targeted debt restructuring, progressive taxation, and investment in productivity-enhancing infrastructure. Financial regulators must also work to address the systemic risks posed by asset bubbles and over-leveraged institutions. Ultimately, the pandemic served as a wake-up call, highlighting the fragility of a financial system built on ever-expanding debt. Without significant reforms, the world risks sleepwalking into a new era of economic instability, one in which the consequences of unchecked borrowing are felt not just by nations, but by millions of individuals and families who depend on a stable financial system for their livelihoods. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. What anchors the future? As the global economy navigates a post-pandemic world marked by record debt levels, growing inequality, and rising geopolitical tensions, one pressing question remains. Are we heading toward another recession, or is the world on the brink of an unprecedented economic collapse? The answer largely depends on the decisions made by governments, central banks, and financial institutions in the coming years. The warning signs of economic fragility are clear. Persistent inflation, mounting debt, and widening wealth gaps have created a volatile environment where small shocks can trigger widespread instability. Meanwhile, structural issues such as climate change, aging populations, and the ongoing technological transformation of industries pose long-term challenges that require bold, coordinated action. One potential path forward is a shift toward greater fiscal responsibility and monetary discipline. Governments and central banks must address the unsustainable levels of debt accumulated in recent years. This could involve measures such as debt restructuring, targeted austerity, or progressive taxation to reduce deficits without exacerbating inequality. However, such policies must be carefully designed to avoid stifling economic growth or imposing undue burdens on vulnerable populations. At the same time, investments in infrastructure, education, and green technologies offer a way to stimulate growth while addressing pressing global issues. By focusing on productivity-enhancing projects, governments can create jobs, reduce inequality, and lay the groundwork for a more resilient economy. This approach requires long-term thinking and international cooperation, as the challenges we face, ranging from climate change to supply chain disruptions, transcend national borders. Another critical area for reform is the financial system itself. Central banks and regulators must take steps to reduce systemic risks, such as tightening oversight of financial institutions, curbing speculative behavior, and addressing asset bubbles. This includes fostering greater transparency and accountability in financial markets, as well as ensuring that monetary policy prioritizes long-term stability over short-term gains. Geopolitically, collaboration will be essential to avoid a race to the bottom. Trade wars, protectionism, and currency manipulation only serve to heighten tensions and disrupt global growth. Instead, nations must work together to build a fairer and more equitable international financial system, one that prioritizes sustainable development and reduces the exploitation of weaker economies. Yet, achieving these reforms is easier said than done. Political polarization, both within and between nations, has made consensus increasingly difficult to achieve. The influence of powerful interest groups often skews policy decisions in favor of short-term gains over long-term stability. Moreover, the public's growing distrust in governments and financial institutions complicates efforts to build support for necessary but difficult reforms. The rise of alternative economic systems and digital currencies also adds complexity to the equation. Cryptocurrencies and decentralized finance, DeFi, have the potential to democratize finance and reduce reliance on traditional banking systems. However, they also pose risks related to regulation, fraud, and volatility. Balancing innovation with stability will be a key challenge for policymakers in the years ahead. Ultimately, the future of the global economy depends on whether governments, financial institutions, and individuals can learn from the mistakes of the past. History has shown that unchecked greed, poor regulation, and a lack of foresight lead to cycles of boom and bust. Breaking this cycle requires a willingness to embrace change, prioritize fairness and sustainability, and address the root causes of instability rather than merely treating its symptoms. The stakes are high. A failure to act decisively could result in not just another recession, but a global economic crisis of unprecedented scale, one that disrupts livelihoods, destabilizes societies, and erodes trust in the very systems designed to support prosperity. Conversely, with bold leadership and a commitment to reform, the world has the opportunity to build a more resilient and equitable financial system, one that serves as a true anchor for the future. The global financial system, from Bretton Woods to modern crises. A warning from history. History is rife with examples of how the misuse and abuse of financial power have precipitated economic crises. From the stock market crash of 1929 to the global financial meltdown of 2008, the patterns are clear. Unchecked greed, excessive risk-taking, and a lack of oversight inevitably lead to disaster. Yet, despite these lessons, the world seems doomed to repeat the same mistakes unless decisive reforms are made to address the vulnerabilities within the global financial system. One of the most glaring lessons from history is that financial crises are rarely isolated events. They are the culmination of systemic issues, imbalances in power, irresponsible policymaking, and the prioritization of short-term profits over long-term stability. Whether it was the speculative bubbles of the 19th century or the housing crisis of the early 21st century, each episode underscores the dangers of a system where accountability and sustainability take a backseat to immediate gains. To prevent history from repeating itself, meaningful reforms are essential. Global financial governance must become more transparent, equitable, and inclusive. Regulators must ensure that financial institutions operate with integrity, prioritizing the well-being of people and economies over shareholder profits. Central banks must adopt policies that balance economic growth with inflation control and financial stability. Most importantly, individuals, businesses, and governments must recognize that sustainable prosperity requires collective responsibility and restraint. This call to action extends beyond policymakers and financial institutions. Each of us has a role to play in demanding accountability, educating ourselves about financial systems, and advocating for change. Together, we can create a more resilient global economy, one that values fairness, transparency, and sustainability. At our channel, we believe in empowering individuals with the knowledge to understand and navigate the complexities of our financial world. For us, every action you take, whether it's engaging with our content, sharing it with others, or reflecting on its lessons, brings immense joy and motivation. Your support fuels our mission to deliver meaningful insights and help build a better future for you and for everyone. Thank you for being part of this journey. Your engagement isn't just a small action. It's a powerful force that drives us to continue creating value for you and for communities around the world. Together, we can learn from history and work toward a brighter, more equitable future.